Hello, I welcome you to the congregation I currently serve, Trinity Methodist Church in Linden, Johannesburg. Behind me is the stained glass window in this sanctuary, a very beautiful stained glass window portraying the birth and the ministry, the death and the resurrection of Jesus. A large part of the window is dedicated to his birth. At the apex of the window is the giving of the Spirit. Another large part is taken up by his resurrection, and the death of Jesus is symbolized by the tomb behind him in that part of the window. One of the fascinating things and important things is the stones that are scattered throughout the window on the ground. And they speak to me of the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, where during this long fast, he is tempted to turn stones into bread, but he resists the temptation by saying, no, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And I believe in that, underlining his own teaching ministry, because that is what he is here to do, is to bring the truth and be an agent of the truth, God's light, in his teaching ministry. So this stained glass window represents the world of art that has been inspired by Jesus. This sanctuary represents the world of architecture that has been inspired by Jesus. And so I want to lead us in a reflection at the beginning of this video on all the ways in which the world has changed, or some of the most important ways in which the world has changed as a result of the ministry of Jesus. And I'll quickly show us that the most important ways in which it has changed has not been through art and architecture, but something much more fundamental and important in the life of the world. Jesus gave us a new picture of God, and the picture we get of God from Jesus is that God is kind, loving, gentle, serving, not just serving, but willing to suffer in loving service of us as people, and particularly the ones in need. This was a remarkable picture, and we mustn't take it for granted, because 2,000 years ago, the picture people had of God then depended on where they lived in the world, but a large picture people had of God was that God was a warlord, and you worshipped that God through sacrificing children. Another picture of God was that God was a fertility God, and you worshipped that God in temple orgies. Another picture of God was that God was obsessed with rules and regulations and would punish to many generations the people who violated his rules and regulations. So Jesus gives us something incredibly precious, and that has been perhaps one of the biggest gifts to the world because of Jesus. Jesus also shows us and gives to us a new way of being human. The way of being human in the world changed as a result of Jesus. Jesus showed a way of living for others, and compassion was the driving force of his life. Now, that had not been lived in a consistent, broad way before Jesus. But then, as a result of Jesus and him giving his Spirit to us, it becomes possible for humans to live that way. One cannot underestimate what that has meant for human development in this world. Another important impact of Jesus is that the tide turned in terms of humanity's relationship with God. A tide turned from alienation in relationship to God towards reconciliation in our relationship with God. Humanity could now be reconciled to God, and there could be such a thing as intimacy and deep communion with God amongst many, many peoples. And this had not existed in a broad way before Jesus, but was made possible because of Jesus. The remarkable important feature of this turning tide was that its inclusiveness of people of many tribes and nations and races and cultures. Up until then, the views of God had been very limited to a particular nation or tribe. But now this reconciliation with God was universally available. Now that tide over the last number of centuries since Jesus has been extended in an inclusive and affirming way to new people, people who are normally excluded and had been excluded at that time even. Slaves, for example, women, for example, sexual orientation and gender identity, all of these now found themselves included and affirmed in God's broadening, loving embrace. In the battle between evil and good, Jesus also succeeded in turning the tide of that battle for good and won a decisive victory against evil. And so the victory starts and grows and continues to grow today. There is also a real way in which people then who were trapped in destructive forces were lifted out of that entrapment. And here one particularly thinks of Jesus' healing ministry and the way in which people's lives were changed as a result of meeting Jesus. And then there is also the way in which people who were lifted out of very destructive cosmologies. And we think here of the way in which people lived in superstition and fear of spiritual forces that could control their lives. There is freedom in Jesus from those spiritual realities, and that became available to the world as a result of Jesus. Very importantly, in the whole area of power, we came to realize as humanity as a result of Jesus that true power lies in servanthood, not in domination. And then generally, people were given a sense and a consciousness that God reigns. God reigns, and that we can honor that reign and know God's reign in this world. That changed many people's lives, and that changed many cultures even. And much of history is about the way in which cultures were changed because of the values of the kingdom of God. So these are some of the most important changes Jesus has brought to history after his short life, much more than just art and architecture. How did Jesus do that? Well, the remainder of this book will make that very, very clear. So in the previous week, we discovered how Jesus is a man of history and God is at work so powerfully in Jesus. I've been talking already now about how Jesus has changed history, but I want to try and get under the skin of that now and to appreciate how Jesus brings a new reality into being. Objectively, brings a new reality into being. And this chapter is a very important part of that. The other chapter that is very important will be the chapter that deals with Jesus' death and resurrection. But these two chapters and all of the ministry, the teachings in between, show how Jesus brought a new reality into being. So the task now is to appreciate how Jesus in himself changes reality and makes oneness with God as a reality available to us all. So one of the ways in which you can see this is that Jesus in himself lived out a life of oneness with God. There wasn't within Jesus' being so much a sense of, here I am a human and there is God. There was a very strong sense of a community between himself and God, whom he called Abba. Now, it was very clear that Jesus wanted others to experience that and did what he could so that others may experience that. And many did go on to experience a oneness like Jesus had. Not quite in the same way, but he certainly made oneness with God as a reality available to all humans through the way in which he was a human being. The other way would be to see it in this way, is that Jesus was experienced as someone through whom God had stepped into history. And with that faith perspective, one sees God has taken the initiative to come to humanity and be one with humanity. So those are two options to see that in Jesus, oneness with God is a reality available to all, something tangible, something objective that is available to all. So in Jesus then, the tide is turned from a time in human history of division from God into a time when reconciliation with God is possible. Jesus gives to us a really beautiful picture within which we may understand from Jesus' worldview how we can appreciate this union between God and humanity that he himself is making possible. So what Jesus does is he picks up on the Old Testament image that God has offered God's self to be a marriage partner to the people of Israel, that he will take the people of Israel as his bride and he will be the husband, and that Jesus then says that marriage that was promised in the Old Testament, in the prophets and other writings, is consummated through Jesus' own ministry. That's the picture he gives, and I just want to unpack that a little bit for us because it's really, really precious. So let's think about weddings at the time of Jesus. This is how weddings went at the time of Jesus. It would begin with the betrothal, which is very similar to our engagement, except it had a lot more gravity even than our engagements do. So the betrothal would happen, the husband-to-be would go and meet with the bride's parents, a bride price, like a lobola, would be decided upon, and that bride price would be paid. Once that bride price had been paid, it was considered then that the husband-to-be and the wife-to-be were in covenant with each other and were actually by society then regarded as husband and wife. But their marriage was as yet not consummated. They would then have a period of separation of about 12 months. And during that 12 months, the bride-to-be would prepare her trousseau, her bottom drawer, her things that she would need for the house. He would prepare the home where they would be living, and it's often the home of his parents would then become his home. And so that would be a period of preparation. The wedding itself, there wasn't an exact date assigned for the wedding. This is very interesting. So he would say it would happen in that week, for example. She would then wait with bridesmaids, virgins, and they would now wait for the groom to come and fetch her. So she would wait at her house, her birth home, for him to come and fetch her. But she doesn't know when he's going to come. She know not the day or the hour of his coming. So she waits. She knows it's going to be in that week. When in the week, she doesn't know. So she waits. And then he comes and fetches her. He takes her to the home that they're going to live in, and they consummate the marriage. The best man is the one who waits at the door of this bridal chamber where they have gone in to consummate the marriage. And once the marriage has been consummated, it's been confirmed she was a virgin, and they have successfully consummated the marriage, the groom then announces to the good news to the best man who's been waiting at the door. And the best man then announces that the festivities may begin. He hears the groom's voice and is glad at the news, and then announces that the festivities may begin. And then the partying begins, which lasts 7 days. So that's marriage at the time of Jesus. And let's now go back to what Jesus is saying to us as a way of understanding what's happening in and through his ministry. So he would want us to see that the prophets who spoke about God as the groom and Israel as the bride, that was the betrothal, what we would call the engagement. They were considered husband and wife, but they had not yet consummated the marriage. The price had been paid, and one would particularly see that the price that has been paid was the freeing of the people from slavery in Egypt. That was the price God paid, as it were, to have this bride. And that's been paid, and the bride is now his, but it hadn't been consummated. What's very interesting in Old Testament literature, and I unpack it in my book, is the way in which that bride-to-be is unfaithful and often seen even as a whore. She goes after other men. Which is the people of Israel going after other gods, betraying Yahweh, her God, her husband-to-be. But then in Jesus comes the groom, and the coming of the groom to an unfaithful bride is a remarkable statement of forgiveness, and how God is saying, even though you have been unfaithful, I still want to be in relationship with you. Your sins are forgiven. So just in Jesus coming to us, in God coming to us in Jesus, there is a huge news of grace and forgiveness. Too often we think of forgiveness of sins as a result of Jesus' death, but no, it is because of Jesus and his ministry and his birth that the consummation happens, and that is a sign of God's forgiveness of us who have been so unfaithful so often. And this is why the whole, Jesus has many parables about saying that the kingdom of God is like a wedding banquet, and I give references to that in the book. Please do look carefully in that. I'll give you page references just now. But the point really is that Jesus sees his coming as the coming of the groom, and the feasting may begin because the marriage has been consummated. That's also why Jesus says his disciples do not fast like the disciples of John, because the groom is here. The other interesting thing is John the Baptizer sees himself as the groomsman, and there are the passages where John says, I waited for the master's voice and was glad when I heard the master's voice, the groom's voice. So there's something really beautiful going on there. And the feasting then, the celebration of the consummation. So all of this is a very beautiful way in which Jesus gives to us, and then the New Testament writers, Paul picks up on this. It becomes the the defining metaphor really for understanding what God has done in Jesus, in his birth and in his ministry. I hope you find that meaningful. I enjoyed telling it to you. So I unpack in detail a lot of what I've said between pages 115 and 120. Please do really look carefully at that. I've tried to give you an overview of that, and I've also gone and given you some extra information just about weddings at the time of Jesus, just to help you find the flavor of this very beautiful metaphor. I want to spend a moment focusing on this nativity scene next to me. This has been a precious nativity scene for me for many, many years. It goes back all the way to the mid-1990s. The first congregation I served at after ordination was Sea Point Methodist Church, which didn't have a youth, but we had a youth pastor. Why did we do that? We had a very special young lady who worked amongst the street children of Sea Point, Philomene Luyindula. And she was a wonderful artist with clay, and she made this nativity scene. And so I have really loved it and treasured it ever since, and put it out every Christmas in our home. And nativity scenes and the whole atmosphere and festivities and the carols we sing at Christmas time celebrate all that God has done in God's coming to us in Jesus. And the Mary's Boy Child song, which I referred to, that humanity shall live forevermore because of Christmas Day. You know, we're aware at Christmas time of the saving significance of Jesus' birth. And what I'm trying to do in this chapter is help us appreciate, not just at Christmas time, but carry that in our Christian awareness, the saving significance of Jesus' birth. So having spoken about Jesus' birth, I want to now talk about his ministry from the perspective of the four relationships of life. And so having said that, in his birth, he reestablishes friendship with God as a reality available to all, unity, community, harmony, the marriage metaphor. Now let's turn to Jesus' ministry. Now, Jesus wanted to emphasize God's love for all, and the way in which he goes about doing that is to particularly show love to those who are rejected in society, those on the margins, those who have been pushed out in society. And he particularly pays attention to them, and in that way is demonstrating God's love for all by focusing those that society is not loving. And these are known as the sinners, and they are made up, and sinners must be appreciated at the time then, not just as a moral category like we would view it, but really as a social class. So they were viewed as sinners, which had the moral connotation, but they were really a class of people. And by class, one is understanding these to be the poor, the cripple, the lame, the blind, the sick. They were also in that state because of certain professions, herdsmen, money lenders, prostitutes, tax collectors, gamblers, the uneducated, those who don't pay their tithes to the temple, those who were negligent in all the regulations of the Jewish law. These people were rejected by religious authorities, And because they are rejected by religious authorities, they are rejected in the name of God, and these people would then have seen themselves as rejected by God. It's important to just appreciate that, for example, take poverty. It was considered that poverty was something caused by God because of one's sin, and wealth was something given by God because of one's virtue. And so to reject the poor meant that you were in agreement with God's judgment of those people. That's why they then got caught up with a moral term like sinners. But these were people who were really, in our understanding today, the marginalized of society, the abandoned peoples of society. But they gave it a very religious connotation. So Jesus, as a man of God, comes to pay particular attention to them and love for them. When Jesus is called the friend of sinners, that was a statement that was meant to spread around, and the reputation Jesus was meant to get with that, and I suppose for some did get for that, was don't take this man seriously. He's a friend of sinners. Who can take somebody seriously who's a friend of sinners? And especially if he's saying he's also a friend of God. And downstream from in future chapters, we'll understand also how that plays itself out. But the big thing here then to see is that in Jesus' ministry, he reestablishes friendship between God and people as a reality available to all. So Jesus' ministry also laid the foundations for good community life amongst people. He taught people to love. He showed people how to love. He shared what are the values of God's reign, values like sharing rather than greed, values like people rather than prestige. He taught loving service as the most powerful force. He called 12 disciples, formed them into a community. So there are all these things that Jesus did to establish and nurture good community life amongst people. The Apostle Paul, who was a leader of the early church, the early Jesus movement, was eloquent in the ways in which he realized the world had changed because of Jesus, and how he reflected even that in his flesh, Jesus's flesh, people who had been previously divided, and at that stage the world was divided between, certainly from a Jewish perspective, between Gentile and Jew. Those were the two categories. And so within that worldview, the two are made one in the very flesh of Jesus. The dividing wall is broken down. I mean, that's a remarkable description because of what Jesus has done. And so we realize in Jesus' ministry, he re-established friendship amongst people as a reality that is now available to all. So Jesus' ministry, particularly his healing ministry and the way in which he related to people who weren't obviously physically ill but were held in bondage emotionally, this whole healing ministry was setting people free from those things that held them bondage, from forces and illnesses that were diminishing their life. And so he also enabled people to overcome sin, to leave sin behind and make a new start to life. And so in his ministry, he's really creating a harmony, an inner harmony with people, so that there is a life-giving relationship with themselves, and they can have a sense of union, communion, harmony with themselves and having come to peace with their past, something very precious that he gave them in his ministry, and to meet him was to experience this from him. So Jesus' ministry then re-establishes friendship with ourselves as a reality that is available to us all. And then I want to touch on Jesus' relationship with creation and the human-made environment. It is very precious to see Jesus' own closeness with creation, his own appreciation of creation. There is a lovely reference in Mark's Gospel to when he was in the wilderness being tempted, that he was with the animals. There was a community between him and the animals. That really captures the imagination. We know Jesus really paid attention to creation. He knew God cared for us through creation. He taught about that. He often referred to parts of creation in his parables. So there was a real affinity and appreciation. And then in terms of the human-made environment, which is meant to be hospitable to us, this was a strong emphasis for Jesus. He objected strongly to all the systems of the day that were oppressive to people. He objected to the corruption that was wasteful of resources and, again, impoverished people. And this was a major part of his ministry, ultimately would be part of why he is executed by religious and political leaders of the day. But he really saw it as important that the systems of society should be honor God in the way in which they made life better. And so we can appreciate that in his ministry, Jesus established the way in which a life-giving communion between people and their environment could be possible. In my book, I close this chapter with a summary, putting the chapter in a nutshell. Please do look at it. Please notice that in this chapter I am showing how in Jesus' birth and in his ministry there is what we call the saving significance of Jesus. And it's important that I highlight that for you, and that I really invite you to take that to heart, because in most preaching and teaching, the saving significance of Jesus is related to his death. But I want you to see that there is much saving significance in his birth and in his ministry. If Jesus had only come that he die in order to have saving significance, then, there would have been no need to protect him from Herod soon after he was born. Remember, Herod was out to kill the babies, and Jesus was protected from that. He was protected because his ministry was important in his work, and I really want you to appreciate that. And so, to underline that importance, the next chapter begins a journey that will last, in fact, 8 chapters of the book and 8 separate videos of this book, because there I unpack the detail of Jesus' ministry, what he taught, how he ministered, what it meant, what we may learn from it. It's a very important journey. For many, it's going to be discovering things that have been neglected. And this is part of how I am helping you find the shepherd that you lost, or the shepherd that hasn't been offered to you, aspects of the shepherd that have been neglected in what you have been taught, in what you have read, in what you have heard, in what you have explored yourself. I think it's going to be a very meaningful journey. It certainly is an important journey. But for now, we come to the end of this chapter, and it's an opportunity now for you to spend some time discussing and reflecting. I'm sure there's many special things that you could talk about, new things that you've learned in this chapter. So please do remember page 126, 127. I have questions to guide your discussion. Feel free to raise your own questions and to deal with them. Remember the summary of the chapter on page 125, and don't forget the God Spoke to Me page of page 128. God bless you.